Okay, this is the last time I am starting this video. Hello people, adults, children, friends, frenemies. If you don't know me, I'm Maan. If you do know me, you're probably sick of me, so that's fine. Anyway, let's talk about what I wanted to talk about in this video, which is this book that I read, not recently, I actually read it about 5 months ago, but it has been stuck in my head ever since. It is called, where is it? Beauty by Sheri S Tepper. I have never heard of this author, and I am shocked by myself for not having heard of her, because she's pretty amazing. How I came across her was in a really random, roundabout way. I was online doing some research trying to find out what happened to Lavender Brown from Harry Potter. Yeah, so basically, as a Potterhead, I'm very confused as to whether Lavender Brown died or didn't die in Harry Potter. The book is quite vague, the film is quite vague. Nobody seems to really have a clear answer, which is really quite annoying. If you have an answer, if you have a theory, please just comment below because I'm very confusion. Somebody said something along the lines of, you know, what's the big deal? Why is she such an important writer? And I don't get the Harry Potter books. She's obviously just a Sheri S Tepper wannabe, and she was very influenced by the True Game series. And I was like, who the hell is Sheri S Tepper, and what is the True Game series? So I Googled her, and there isn't much information about her on her Wikipedia page or just generally out there. She's basically this sci-fi feminist fantasy writer from America. She's passed on now, who wrote a lot of books in the 70s, 80s, 90s, actually 80s, 90s, I think. And she seemed to have a very strong cult following. So I went to my local bookstore and I asked them if they have any books by her, because she's got loads of books, and they had none except for this book, Beauty, by her, Sheri S Tepper. And I thought, very Sleeping Beauty-esque with the title and the cover. And I wasn't sure if I was going to buy her or not, because I really wanted to buy the True Game series. But I sat in the bookstore and I had a read, and I read the first 3 chapters and I was hooked. So I bought the book and I read it within a couple of days, and I've reread it again after I finished reading it because it was just such a... So what is this book about? Okay, the novel Beauty is... It's hard to explain because it is a fantasy, it is a science fiction book, it is time traveling. It is about the 14th century, it's about contemporary times, it's about the future. It has very strong feminist undertones, it has fairy tales, it has folk, it has magic, it's political, it's environmental, post-apocalypse, pre-apocalypse, and all of these things exist in complete balance in this novel, which is not that big, by the way. Basically, reading this book, the first book I've ever read by her, it just proves to me that she is a master storyteller. Because to be able to bring all of those different genres and all of those different ideas into one story that's pretty streamlined is quite mind-boggling and amazing. Now, obviously, I'm not saying the novel is perfect and it's not without its flaws. There are a lot of ideas in there, but they seem to work well. And of course, there are some things that could have been better. But as a novel, I have never read anything like this before. God, I'm really building this novel up. I hope you guys don't end up reading it and hating it. Well, it's actually interesting because a lot of people online either hated it or loved it. I am obviously from the love it camp. It was a very polarizing novel. So the novel starts with our main character called Beauty in the 14th century, where she's the daughter of this kind of rich lord who forgets about her because he's always going off on these like religious pilgrimage. And she's left with her aunts, who are all kind of also very religious and very strange. And she's quite spoiled. She doesn't know much about her mother. And she's very pretty, obviously. So she finds out that her mother is a fairy. So Beauty is half human, half fairy. And that her mother is trying to call her back or call her to come join her in the fairy world, and leaves all these clues in the castle. So Beauty is obviously Sleeping Beauty. And she has this spell cast, or this curse on her, that she will, you know, prick her finger on a spinning wheel when she's 16 and go into a deep sleep that only true love's kiss can awaken, blah, blah, blah. And what happens then, I don't want to give out too many spoilers, but what happens is that she doesn't fall asleep and she ends up traveling to the future and sees what the world becomes, and then has this mission in her mind where she wants to save the world from the future. But at the same time, she's trying to figure out, find her mother, her fairy mother, trying to understand who she is as this part human, part fairy, trying to understand what it means to be human. There's also this villain who is from the future, who's like obsessed with her. And he kind of is this personification, I think, of all the evil, disgusting, vile patriarchy in the world, kind of embodied in this one person in a very, I think, like gruesome and violent way. And all the while, she's in love with this guy from her time in the 14th century. And this is what's so amazing about Sheri S Tepper. She adds this rich world of fables and myth and fairy tales that we all know in this really realistic way, in this very fantastical and realistic world. So I don't want to give too much away, but within the story we end up seeing the inspiration for a lot of fairy tales that we know, such as Cinderella and Snow White and Rapunzel and, you know, evil queens that we know. I really loved the sections of the novel that described the future and what happened in the future. The way she wrote about that world was quite frightening and very interesting and, you know, very visually stimulating. And I also loved reading about when Beauty got to go to the fairy world, where she went to find her mother, and how she described the fairies, the history of their people, and how they sort of became who they are, and their relationship with mankind and with humans, and how they view humanity and how they view them as kind of like animals. And that idea of animals and humans being animals is so interestingly done from so many different perspectives. Through Beauty's perspective, through the fairy's perspective, through the future of how we all kind of end up becoming. So with all these different elements and these different genres in one novel, in one story, what brings them all together isn't only the fact that we're with Beauty the whole time as the main character, but it's also the style in which Sheri S Tepper has written. By the way, it's written in the first person narrative, so we're always with Beauty. So it doesn't matter if we're reading a part that's very, you know, fantasy or very science fiction or very futuristic or really in the 14th century in the past. The themes are all very strong. But what I really loved about this book is that in the essence of it, with all that stuff out the way, it's really about this one character, Beauty, who we are with from when she is 16 up until she's 116. And we see her traveling through time, traveling through different realms, trying to save the world. She takes it upon herself to save humanity. And the fact that she is half human, half fairy also is kind of the reason why we think she should save humanity, because she sees, I suppose, she has this different perspective compared to all the other characters in the book. However, while she's, you know, doing this whole thing of saving the world, she's still dealing with some very human emotions: abandonment, love, lust, revenge, a thirst for knowledge, her humanity. And it's really interesting because I've been reading a lot of novels about people who are half fairy or half god or half something else. And it seems that a common theme in all of these stories, including this one, is that your humanity, the part of you that's human, is the thing that helps propel you forward in your journey, but it's also at the same time the thing that pushes you back or creates obstacles for you. Things that I think were done very well and parts that I enjoyed reading in this book was when Beauty traveled to the future. I think the grim future, the way it was described, how bleak it is, was done so well that it scared me, and it's so relevant. I can't believe this book was published in 1991, because the stuff that Sheri S Tepper is writing about is relevant to what's happening in the world today. The other part that I really enjoyed was when Beauty would travel to the fairy world, which is where her mother is from, and how that world was described, its history, the fairy people. There's different kinds, different races of fairies, and their history, how they viewed the world. And what's really great about books like this is that if you are somebody who loves fairy tales, or even if you don't love fairy tales, everybody knows, you know, the main ones that we all know, grew up with: Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, blah, blah, blah. When you're reading this book and it's, you know, written in a very realistic way, you get whiffs? You get these little hints and inklings and whiffs? You get these hints and inklings and little clues everywhere that sometimes they're very obvious, sometimes they're very subtle, of the origins of the story, of these fairy tales as Sheri S Tepper has imagined them in this world. Some of the criticism I read online is that it's a bit preachy, and that sometimes her political agenda or her social agenda is really sort of like pushed through through the novel. I didn't feel that. I didn't feel I was being told anything, I was being forced any ideas down my throat. But I can see how some people who are maybe more sensitive to that kind of stuff would feel that reading the book. Basically, I cannot recommend this book enough. If you're into fantasy or sci-fi or time traveling, or if you're not and you want to try something different, then definitely give this book a go. I cannot recommend it enough. It's witty, it's rich, it's interesting, it's timely, it's well written, it's really beautiful. It's just a brilliant book, so definitely read it. I am going to be reading some of her other books. I downloaded The True Game onto my Kindle and I read the first 3 chapters, and it's very different from how this book is written. The language is very different and the world is very different, and so I wasn't sure if I was gonna get into it or not. But 4 months on since I read those 3 chapters, they're still very vivid in my memory, so that must mean that there's something there. So I'm gonna go back and I think read it on my Kindle once I finish all the other stuff that I'm reading. So thanks for listening and watching, and if you have read this book or have read any other books by Sheri S Tepper, please comment below. I would love to have a discussion with anyone about this, because here's another thing. Not many people have read this book, which is really annoying because I want to talk to somebody about it who has read it. So if you have, comment or send this video to somebody who has read it, and you can follow me on all the other stuff, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. It's all down there below. So thank you, and happy reading. Toodle-oo. Goodbye.